Super. So we now move to Raisa. And speaking of Raisa, we have a panel. Father Albert Robertson, one of our brethren from Cambridge, assistant chaplain at Fisher House, the Cambridge University Catholic Chaplaincy, and lecturer in anthropology here in the Blackfriars Studio. And Professor Emma Mason. Lovely to have you back, Emma. Emma was one of the speakers, and I think one of the coordinators of the Forgotten Voices.
Oh no, it's Claire who was the coordinator.
No, I know Claire was chairing. Yes,
I was speaking, but yeah.
Yes, but so on Catholic women writers last year. So very nice to have you back on a.
Raisa Maritain was a woman whose life was marked by intense and elusive prayer. One moment, this wordless, intuitive, and quite simple prayer would flood her whole person, and at other times entirely abandon her. Across the course of her life, through the ups and downs of her own spiritual life, but also those terrible years of war, which she endured as a kind of passionate martyrdom, she recorded her experiences in a series of journals, which only came to full light after her death, the discovery of which Jack experienced with a wave of overwhelming emotion. But Raisa was also a poet, writing poems and essays on poetry in close collaboration with her husband. So here I want to give a sense of the relationship a little between her journals and her poetry, suggesting that she was a humane and coherent theodicy from the midst of great anguish, which does not admit of straightforward redemption. Just as when theology deals with the mystery of light, when there is just too much for us to say, we have to turn to poetry, so too it is the case in the mystery of iniquity. Poetry is perhaps the only form of language with the tensile strength to begin to grapple with the mystery. What I'd like to finally show is the way in which poetry and mystical contemplation can meet in grappling the mystery of evil. Jacques and Raisa are quite clear that poetry and mystical contemplation are different, with different objects, even though they have a similar call on the human heart. Mystical contemplation is directed towards God. The poet, on the other hand, while able to apprehend something of the immediate knowledge of things, has an end in the creation of the poem. However, when dealing with the mystery of evil, we are not dealing with a contemplation of being, but with the confrontation of a lack of being. In this way, poetic and spiritual knowledge confronting the evils in our world can in fact find themselves engaged in a common task, despite their differences. In recent years, the possibility of offering theodicy has come into question. Proponents of anti-theodicy argue that the effort to produce a theodicy is itself part of the problem of evil. Some have claimed there's a question mark over the moral propriety of the discussion within theodicies, such that any believer should hesitate ever to embark on it. Theodicy, it is claimed, creates a distance between suffering and explanation, which contributes to the evil through a kind of distance. While I do think it is possible to offer a humane and coherent theodicy, I do share with proponents of anti-theodicy an unease about the language employed in some arguments. So, for example, Stephen Davis relates how he outgrew the feelings of embarrassment surrounding a teenage faux pas, which he goes on to suggest is similar to the way that people outgrow experiences of suffering. In an analogous way, he argues, people will be able to look back from the perspectives of the kingdom of God and see that their past sufferings, no matter how severe, prolonged, or undeserved, have been overcome and no longer matter. We might just dismiss this as a bad argument, slightly ham-fisted, but even the most metaphysically coherent language can seem rather deaf in the rawness of experience. The idea of evil given by Herbert McCabe, English Dominican 20th century, where evil is described as being like a hole in the sock, is certainly a good catechetical example, but it captures the reality of evil. We can definitely tell when there's a hole in our sock. It encapsulates something of the problem, but the difficulty remains the kinds of pain and suffering which Raisa and so many others experienced feels dismissed if we speak of it as simply a hole in the sock. Beyond these moral considerations, there are also the greater metaphysical questions. What Marilyn McCord Adams has called horrendous evils are precisely those evils which are disteleological in nature, and Theodices's sometimes ham-fisted attempt to offer a telos, perhaps impose a telos on evil, is not just morally problematic, but possibly metaphysically incoherent. Raisa herself was a true disciple of St. Thomas, and so she would not want to simply dismiss the metaphysically coherent arguments of the likes of Herbert. In her diary entry on the 16th of July 1919, she records her own thoughts on metaphysics. She writes, "As it governs theodicy and ethics, we are drawn by preference to it, in order to examine in this supreme light what our whole life ought to be. Metaphysics is not just a way of understanding reality, but also a process of self-discovery, of self-realization." However, Raisa does point us towards a different form of language which can supplement our metaphysically coherent philosophy and theology. Here, Eleanor Stump's contribution is helpful. In Wandering in Darkness, Stump argues that a purely abstract account of suffering, what she rather unhelpfully calls Dominican knowledge, requires another non-abstract intuitive knowledge, on Stump's account, again rather unhelpfully, Franciscan knowledge. This knowledge gives a fuller and more rounded picture of the question of suffering. Stump offers two statements by way of an example. The first is that Thomas Aquinas knew that God is present in the Eucharist. This is what Stump describes as knowledge that, and the abstract knowledge of, in this case, the metaphysics of sacramental presence. The second example she offers is Thomas Aquinas knew the presence of God in the Eucharist. Such knowledge is intuitive, personal, and relational. I'd argue that it is this intuitive knowledge which made St. Thomas the supreme poet of paradox in his poetry on the Eucharist. Eleanor Stump argues that this kind of intuitive knowledge is found in narrative, which must form a part of our language around suffering. Here, we must consider the power of poetry and narrative. The 20th century English Dominican Thomas Gilby argues that poetic experience touches the reality of things. It's not a detached form of conceptual knowledge. Rather, he suggests poetic knowledge and experience anticipates beatitude. But beatific knowledge is not of principles, but of things as they really are. In this respect, his argument closely follows that of Jacques and Raisa, who speak of the power of poetry to elicit a kind of immediate understanding which is non-conceptual. But as well as apprehension, narrative and poetry can bring about a kind of imaginative identification. As Chinua Achebe emphasizes in his essay on the truth of fiction, in narrative, things are not merely happening before us, but they are happening by the power and force of imaginative identification to us. And as the poet Seamus Heaney said of art, there's something in the masquerade and fiction of art which allows us to see the possibilities of what we, others, and the world more generally can or might be. So having outlined something of the possibilities of poetic theodicy, we can now ask how this is achieved. For both Jacques and Raisa, this is through the life of contemplation, a life which is shared at least somewhat by both artists and by contemplatives. Although Raisa never offered a new way of prayer, really, Raisa in particular shares with St. Therese of Lisieux and St. Charles de Foucault a sense that this spiritual tradition, this ancient spiritual tradition, needs to break out from the cloister into the world. The gift of contemplative recollection and the kind of wordless prayer which Raisa speaks of in her journal can be found in the world. Sometimes this gift is hidden even from the souls themselves, sometimes known only to friends or to directors. This way of prayer is quite simple, a life without the visions or miracles which mark the pages of hagiographical accounts of the mystics. This, the Maritans argue, is a particular gift and vocation given at a time of particular darkness in the world. Raisa recorded her spiritual experiences in her journals, both the ups and downs of her spiritual life. And I won't go into the full extent of her developing prayer life here, but the focus on the particular experiences of suffering which her life of prayer brought are important for giving some contexts. Raisa's health had always been delicate, especially since a particularly great illness early on in her marriage. Illness marked her experience of spiritual growth, and indeed seems to be linked to a lot of her experiences of spiritual breakthrough. We have to be attentive, though, to the ambiguities of this suffering, again, a topic which is too far away from this short introduction. One of the characteristics of Raisa's spiritual experience is also hospitality and friendship. Friendship was central to the life of Jacques Raisa and Vera, and it's not hard to see in their little flock a living icon of the life of Bethany. The effective union with God, a kind of knowledge which is non-conceptual and immediate, is brought about through prayer and suffering divine things. For Raisa and for many before her, suffering and mystical experience brought not just knowledge and union with God, but a knowledge which also changed how she and other mystics like her saw the world. It accounts for the way that the lives of the saints have a kind of liminality. It's at the heart of the playful seriousness of sanctity. It's because of this that the saints and mystics see the world as it truly is. There's a truth to the sight of the mystic, just as there is a truth to the sight of the poet. And it's this vision which enables both poet and mystic to contextualize suffering, to see the particular case or incident within the light of the whole of human suffering, but also to honor the particularity of suffering individuals. Writing in her journal on the 5th of November 1939, Raisa shows this well when she sees her Polish maid Marie and sees her as a kind of icon of suffering, both her and her own people's. She says, "Then I saw Marie pass, going to take up her place in church, a humble, touching little figure in her clothes of some dark, indeterminate colour, which became even dimmer as they brushed against the benches. She too appeared to me as defenceless poverty, the image of her country, devastated Poland." Contemplation, supernatural and poetic, offers a different vision of the world that changes our way of effectively relating to it. So, moving to her poetry. If contemplation on the roads of the world, what the Maritans described as kind of contemplation breaking out of a cloister, if contemplation on the roads of the world forms the background of her poetic theodicy, what form does it take in the concrete? Although I haven't been able to give a full account of my argument for the ways that contemplative prayer and poetic experience change our view of the world, we can see this a little more when we look to Raisa's poetry and journals. As the situation in Europe deteriorated, and as war broke out and news of Jewish persecution became more widely known, Raisa leaves her journals aside. Increasingly, she is not able to record her experiences in her journal, and her poetry takes to more darker themes. By Sunday, the 18th of February 1934, the Saturday after Ash Wednesday that year, Raisa describes herself as being stretched out on the cross, transfixed through the heart as if with a lance. Just as Raisa's journal entries cease, her poetry takes on this new form of crucifixion. In her poem Meditation, Tasma, dated 1936, Raisa gives voice to this growing darkness. Yet, in all its darkness, there is still a moment of transcendence. In the poem, Raisa speaks of darkness below and darkness above, both from below in the world around her and from the heights in her contemplative prayer. There's only a little good that seems purchased from or built upon so many evils. I've given you the poem on the handout. We can see clearly the sense of God's providence, that we are still shadowed by the protecting angel. God manages to write a straight history through our meandering journey along the lazy byways of iniquity. Like so much of her poetry from the period immediately before the Second World War, it admits something of the blessedness of this passing shadow, suggesting that our benighted present state will yield fruit, which our prelapsarian state would never have produced. Written in the same year, Raissa's poetry poem De Profundis marks a similar trajectory, but certainly a more spiritual appeal. The good is vulnerable to the overwhelming darkness which expresses itself in the darkness of God, the apophatic cloud, which makes all that is said of God seem to be sacrilege, but also the abyss into which this spiritual experience thrusts us. Yet, beyond the darkness, the stars will shine. By the late 1930s, Raissa's experience had grown darker still, and her journal lies almost empty. Her focus moves away from the general darkness of the world to its specific instantiation in war. Her poem, To the Despairing Dead, is written in memory of, or perhaps better, crying out for those who have suffered in the German attacks on Poland. In it, Raissa writes, "Our sorrow is so great the sun astounds us. For God, its comfort is no more remembered. The shining of the sun does not seem possible in the face of such miseries. Even the faintest glimmer of hope has passed, and to such an extent that the shining of the sun seems an artifact of some past time. Now darkness has overtaken everything, and injustice and cruelty brings desperation, calamity, and experiences of human evil. Suffering comes not from apophatic darkness, but human iniquity. In this misery, it is not death which is the worst experience, but the desolation of the dread silence of complicity. The focus on complicity and the greater attention paid to injustice and cruelty indicates the power of Raissa's compassion, blurring the distinction between personal and social suffering. The suffering which she experienced in her spiritual life now takes on newer meaning in the suffering experienced by others in war. Again, effective union with God experienced in prayer brings a new perspective on the suffering of others. This experience of compassion reaches its height during the years of the war while Jacques and Raissa were in exile. It was during these darkest days that Raissa wrote one of her most extraordinary poems, Deus Excelsus Terribilis, dated 28th of November 1943. Here the suffering of divine things is placed within the context of an all-consuming suffering of war. We can notice that this poem is addressed to God in the form of a prayer, though a direct plea to God, which highlights its personal character. Once, suffering was understandable because some good was known to exist, but now there is no happiness. All of this is abolished. All of this was before. Before, God certainly wrapped himself in darkness, but his justice shone forth, even in the darkness of his mysterious decrees. But now the slaughter of war and the planned extermination of the Jews, all has changed. She writes, if we cry out, Abba, Father, you do not welcome our cry. These lines are much more than a cry which tells us that our prayer goes unanswered. At stake are the very promises of God. In chapter 8 of the letter to the Romans, Paul tells his readers of life in the Spirit, and that it is the Holy Spirit, the Spirit of adoption, which allows us to call out to God as our Father, our intimate Father, our Abba. Much more than a dark night of the soul, the evil which surrounds Raissa makes it seem as if God's love has come to an end. Here she echoes the cry of Psalm 76, where our remembrance of the past and meditation on the mighty works of the Lord seems to run up against the Lord's forgetfulness. At the heart of the psalm, the psalmist cries, "It is my grief that the right hand of the Most High has changed," a cry which could be Raissa's. The work of the incarnation, that coming of the word in the flesh, has been undone. In the incarnation, the gulf between God and simple humanity has been closed, but now it has been opened once again. What marks such a turn in her poetry? It strikes me as an honest prayer of compassion in the literal sense of suffering with others, and which does not try to simply explain suffering away. It's the voice of suffering which cannot be found in abstract metaphysical argument, explaining the existence of suffering. But what is most striking about her poetry is that it leaves open the question of healing. If the Odyssey creates a distance between explanation of evil and the actual suffering person, so too does imagining healing to be easy. If all things can be simply healed straightforwardly, and some promised future happiness, are we being honest about suffering? She writes, "We shall never forget our agony. We will remember it on earth and in eternal life, for we have been marked with a character of suffering where infinity joins us." For Raissa, the agony which is gone through is not forgotten, indeed cannot be forgotten. It has marked the soul. Future healing, perhaps, but not in a moment when we suffer those things which cannot be said, which the mind refuses to carry. The final two sections of the poem read especially hauntingly. She once again takes up her psalm-like prayer and addresses God directly as the God of promise and covenant, the personal God of the Hebrew Bible, and the God of philosophy. Only in the light of God's benevolent grace will the suffering of the present time be meaningful. Given the degradations of the earth, pity is in vain, justice is dead, and men wish that they had never been born. And so Raisa ends with a plea for the Lord to wake, with sentiments similar to those of Psalm 44, especially verses 23 to 24. Awake, O Lord, why do you sleep? Rouse yourself, do not reject us forever. Why do you hide your face from us? Why do you forget our affliction and oppression? The final plea of the poem is for a new wave of apostles, inspired like the psalmists and prophets. Salvation, the final word of the poem, is still possible, even if it seems remote. But such salvation cannot come easily or be bought cheaply. Rice's poetry certainly evolves over time, and when read alongside her account of her spiritual life in the journals, suggests that the power of poetry takes over when her narrative record of her suffering becomes impossible. Only poetry has the power to express the pain which she encounters. And it should be emphasized, though, that this is not a permanent switch, for she published a second volume of memoirs after this period of darkness. And this in itself, I would suggest, perhaps points to the fact that poetic theodicy is a technique, as much spiritual and artistic, for dealing with the painful experiences of suffering. The answer of how to provide an adequate theology may well be found in Raisa's combination of deep understanding of metaphysical principles from her master St. Thomas Aquinas, but also from her immediate apprehension of evil's lack of being, which finds its expression in her poetry. So some concluding remarks. Raisa and Jack are right to say that poetry has a different object to spirituality or mystical prayer, and they outline these differences extensively in their writing. But this misses the fact that effective union in contemplation brings a fresh, effective knowledge of the world. This is what we see in the lives of the saints, perhaps a kind of playful seriousness which is not quite in heaven, but definitely not at home in the world. In a similar way, the poet looks at the world in a different way, not necessarily, though surely sometimes, from the supernatural vantage point, but one which is certainly similar. While these are certainly different modes of seeing them, they stand in an analogical relationship. When we think of poetic contemplation, we probably think of the beautiful, but much of Raisa's poetry is a cry against the gathering darkness. At a time when her journal falls silent because of the evil that she encounters, it is poetry which can provide a language to articulate the suffering. This, I would suggest, is where poetry and supernatural contemplation meet. This meeting point of contemplation in poetry shows poetry's power. In theology, when no discourse can encompass the mystery we encounter, our prose turns to poetry as the stress of analogical language requires a medium or a form of language which has the tensile strength to be stretched to its limits. This is what we see in Eleanor Stump's distinction between abstract and intuitive knowledge. The same is true when we encounter suffering, when the words of prayer will not do, and when the words of an abstract theology seem cold. The power of poetic language offers a way of articulating pain and suffering which stretches our use and experience of language to try and encompass what we know as experiencing evil. Just as conceptual theodicies fall short by not taking into account the kinds of intuitive knowledge which narrative and poetry can bring, so also our theology falls short without the poetic. When abstract language fails, poetry arrives not as a tool, but as a kind of familiar friend, offering a technique as much spiritual as linguistic to help us encounter the mystery. In spiritual life, effective union through contemplative prayer seeks knowledge of and union with God, who is being himself. In poetry, poetic intuition gives a kind of immediate intuition of created being and participates in the creaturely cooperation in the act of creation through the art. But in evil, suffering and pain, we do not have the same situation. In the case of evil, we have the lack of being, with which both poetry and contemplative prayer must both wrestle. And it's this shared undertaking that they may meet, even if their answers will differ. This is where the poetic theodicy of Raisa Mountain is so powerful, for she shows that suffering is not always straightforward, does not always straightforwardly submit to transfiguration, nor does she force a teleology upon the disteleological. No distance is placed between the writer and sufferer. While faith might see the pains of this life as causes of future glory, mortal perspectives cannot easily see that possibility, especially when so much evil seems to be less a cause of beatitude than a cause of degradation, pulling us down into evil's black hole. This should not be seen as a failure of faith, indeed anything but. Rather, poetry gives a voice to an anguish experienced by poet and mystic alike, and offers us a language which tries to bring meaning to that which is the lack of being and lack of meaning. Raisa shows us that such a task is hard, for she certainly found her Calvary, but the difficulty of this task perhaps shows its necessity.
My paper's basically exactly the same. So if you want to kind of have a little sleep now after lunch, Albert's already said everything very well. I'll just remind you, I'm from a literature department. So one of the things I'm interested in this paper is looking at how Raisa, but also some other women Catholic mystics in the early 20th century are kind of engaging with these questions of being and philosophy and writing poetry in a field where modernism does not get associated with this. Modernism does not mean any of these kinds of writers in the literature field, as you probably know. It still means, you know, Virginia Woolf, James Joyce, C.H. Lawrence. It's a very particular canon. It has been a canon that's expanded over time, for sure. Whether or not that canon's expanded to take seriously the kind of huge Catholic contribution to it across Europe, I'm not sure. So that this work's kind of part of my interest in that. So, in her 1939 essay, Message to Poets Who Are at War, Raisa Maritain declared that poetry is the exteriorization of the artist's intuition of and testimony to the realm of le réel. This tangible and material sense of reality does not invite the artist into moralizing politics or didactic claims. Rather, it is a dark reality, inclusive of both the everyday and the depths of the spirit. And by dark reality, I simply mean the beginning of the 20th century and it's this huge darkness that covers Europe. She also wrote in her 1942 essay, Poetry as Spiritual Experience, that the moral and political should be accessible only through an encounter with poetry, in a state of silence, quote, an inwardness of life, of thought, of conscience. Those who retreat due to contempt for their time, she wrote, end up caught in a sterile loneliness. But the true solitary, the contemplative, the poet are mysteriously connected to the life, work, and the hope of men today. Poetry thus appears from the artist's inner life, what Raisa called the nocturnal navigations of the darkness of the metaphysical and ontological reality of her time. And it's these nocturnal navigations into darkness that I'd like to explore today. Like many early 20th century Catholic thinkers, Raisa found in the mystical contemplation of God and creation a process essential to voicing the trauma of violence and power. As Raisa and Jacques' friend Czesław Miłosz claims, the first half of the 20th century was not hell's first circle, but a much deeper one, in which poetry was essential as bread. A statement that for some might seem facile given the context, Miłosz stressed that poetry was an inner synthesis of new knowledges armed with patience, and as such was, quote, the opposite of didactic art and warfare. My interest then is in how Raisa's nocturnal navigations, as moments in which she ascertained how to develop mystical and poetic discernment, overlap with her interest in intuition and also kenosis, of which James has already spoken about, that kind of sense of and self-emptying. For me, these nocturnal navigations, which I will trace in her journals and her poetry, were a way out of feeling imprisoned within darkness. In 1918, she wrote of the challenges of this feeling and claimed that God had called her to sacrifice self-giving and vigilance over all my intentions. Everything grows darker. The time of childhood is over. By 1922, she framed the painfulness of being in darkness through John of the Cross and his purifying night, infinitely painful, which ceases when the soul has attained the degree of purity and holiness willed by God. Now, the light that emerges from this initial state of darkness is not illuminating then, but terrifying and scorching, a flame of eternal fire that sets the soul on fire. And this fire is not the consuming fire of God, of Hebrews, but the fire described in Exodus 13, wherein by day the Lord went ahead of the Israelites in a pillar of cloud to guide them on their way, and by night in a pillar of fire to give them light. And it's from this fire that Ratius shaped a different kind of night vision, a way to see through the darkness and gain a clarity that could be translated into the poem. In her essay, Sense and Nonsense in Poetry, for example, she described poets who she had read, who offered her clarity through mastery. Homer, Virgil, Dante, Shakespeare, Racine, Goethe, Pushkin, Baudelaire. And she said that these poets were fire thieves or fire takers. Everything burns with these fire thieves, and everything takes the form that poetry's good pleasure requires. Here we find both unheard of discoveries in poetry, the light of intuition and intelligence. And this poetry persuades us that the mystery of the sun and of radiant daylight is not less than that of the dark night. Raisa herself is a mystical fire thief. She kindled a poetic fire in her poetry and prose, journals and letters, to emphasize the urgency of creating light in art in such dark times, a task that, as Milosz wrote, was essential as the provision of bread. But very similarly to what Albert has said, she often doesn't get there. She's trying to create the light, she's trying to steal the fire, but she also refuses to see that as a kind of easy way out through aesthetics. My work on Raisha comes out of a current book project that I'm writing on Catholic women mystics at the turn of the 19th to the 20th century. So it also includes people like Edith Stein, Carol Hauslander, Gerda Wolter, Gertrude von der Fort, all very interesting women, many of them Catholic converts, writing about philosophy and also all writing poetry. These women sought neither to accommodate or appropriate modernity, nor did they challenge or oppose it. Rather, they turned to poetry and philosophy to express their faith in the Catholic Church as the mystical body of Christ, as Pope Pius XII had described it in his 1943 encyclical Mystici Corporis Christi. Now, so often in secular literary criticism, by which I kind of mean literary criticism, the modern religious imagination is consigned to the category of oceanic modernism, or what Mina Loy called the obsessions prescribed by the Holy Church of Rome, re-edited by the psychoanalyst. But Raisa did not edit her faith and embraced the church and its doctrines as the foundation of her poetic imagining, embodying, and bringing about God's kingdom. She received Holy Communion at least once a day, avidly following Aquinas' recommendation of frequent liturgical exercise. And when she was too ill to travel, she sought and was granted permission to have Mass said at home. From 1923, when she and Jacques moved to Meudon, the family were authorised to have a private chapel with the Eucharist always present. From the point of her reception into the church, Raisa was amidst constant nocturnal navigations into God's darkness. Her prayers were silent, contemplative, and active, and drew her into a state of what she called quiet absorption, a form of deep and intense meditation. And I'm aware in the French that that phrase can be translated in many different ways, but I'm using the English translation here, which has it as quiet absorption, which she distinguishes from a state of concentration, and specifically says that it is a gift received, in which the soul is secretly and dynamically unified with God. In a journal entry from 1917, she explained that there are two distinct kinds of quiet absorption. In the first, the eyes remain open, the intellect is enlightened, and the soul is in a kind of ecstasy. In the second, the eyes are closed, the intellect receives nothing, all the affections of the will are, as it were, focused in a single point and united to God, a union which is ardent, often delightful, but takes place in a kind of darkness. A few months later, she found herself unable to sing in Mass, so caught up was she in her prayer. She sought to plunge herself into the darkness of faith and wrote that she would find in doing so the splendor of divine light. From this silent darkness, she received poetry and music through a flare of grace, a process her friend Jeanne Cott called a metaphysical flash, a flash full of the beauty of metaphysics. Grace's experience of grace was as a putting on of the light amidst the gloom, a wave of energy that caused in her a physiological as well as emotional shift. Her nocturnal meditations then were essential to her navigation into the light. Indeed, she called the best part of her life her mornings, from which she wrote, "I draw all my energies. I must at all costs preserve the solitude, silence, and stillness of it." Finding and intuiting grace in the light of the early morning was thus a training in Christian formation for Raisa, and her poetry a response to her time with God. As we read in a journal entry from 1939, "Long time of absorption with God. Shall I write any more poems? With me, poems are not made in the midst of a continuous clamour of the imagination, but in the heart of the most naked silence when it has attained a sufficient degree of depth and purity. I have spent so many years in mortifying the imagination to create in myself the silence propitious to being alone with God." Raisa did not conflate poetry and mysticism, however. She intimated that both the poet and mystic can only intuit reality by withdrawing into silence to empty themselves. But where the poet's silence was one of catharsis and the making of art through mystery, the mystic's silence was one of intensified love for God and his creation. Neither the poet or the mystic hides from the world in this withdrawn state. As she emphasized in her essay, Message to Poets Who Are at War, the poet, the mystic, the solitary, the contemplative are all connected through the mystery of their faith to their work and the hope of real people and the lived community of the church. So in other words, the poet and the mystic they share this kind of interest in what we might call mystical realism, into which believers are gathered in the universal, knowable and comprehensible reality of God, and not in a kind of mystical second reality behind reality. So mysticism for her is very much a kind of material, real, tangible, intellectual and affective practice, a bit like it is for many of the poets that precede her in the 19th century, a good romanticism, if you like. I know we've heard about bad romanticism. So the poet and the mystic, she says that they do this, they kind of get to this point of mystical realism by rejecting these other things, no timidity, no Pharisaism, no ignorance, no prudishness, etc., but rather Catholic doctrine, luminous and total, an assent to the ontological reality of the incarnation, eschatology, revelation, and theodicy. Her mystical realism is thus a commitment to a dimly lit God, whom she glimpsed in written ignitings of the thick darkness where God was. And by written ignitings, I mean her own poetry, but also the mystical poetry of others that she read: Dante, John of the Cross, Charles Péguy, Paul Claudel. Raisa did not seek to escape into the nocturnal, but wades into it to steal a spark she can transform into words. As she writes in these lines from her journal, "In the darkness of human life, a faint light glimmers, like a star sending down its rays from unimaginable distance." By imagining the darkness, Raisa conjures a vision of light that, while faint, glimmering, and abstruse, illuminates her participatory relationship with God. Like John of the Cross, Raisa lets go into the dark night and through her quiet absorption into it, finds herself in what she and Jacques called subsistent love. Mystic contemplation, they wrote in Jacques' book, Degrees of Knowledge, thus exists only for the union of love with God, quote, a form of knowledge by love, a loving attention to God. And I very much go with this idea that Reiser is contributing to many of these books by Jacques. Yeah. So in poems like Meditation, which we've already heard a bit about, Night Letter, All is Light, and the poetic sequence, The Restoration of the Pictures, Reiser becomes the fire thief, taking from the pillar of fire in which God is hidden. And I'll just give you a quote from this prose poem, The Restoration of the Pictures, which I think is sort of extraordinary. And again, sort of she's writing this sort of right from the middle of the intense fear and horror of the war. So she said that she and Jacques were in Rome, not far from the Piazza di Spagna. In the midst of a thick and restless crowd, we were anxious. Was war coming? Then to the left in the sky appeared a mass of light. As it came, it looked at first like a mass of stars. The stars gradually increased in size, and we saw they were a cohort of angels, and all at once the angels were among us. They marched in closed ranks like an army of young men, clothed in black and white. Grace and joy spread everywhere as they passed. Here, Reiser offers us an image of priestly troopers, their black and white vestments signalling their fidelity not to conflict, but to the love of God and his creation. Her vision of angels is not fideism or fantasy, but acknowledgement of the existence of the invisible world. The vision can only be a metaphor or symbol if we read it outside of Reiser's scholastic Thomism. These angels offer her a bridge between God and man, as Aquinas suggested they would, and so to dismiss them as anything other than real in her writing is to contest her belief that God is both transcendent and immanent. Like Rainer Maria Rilke in his Duno elegies, Reiser insists on the reality of these angels to suggest that despite their presence, the world is not spared from horror. And here's another extract from her journals around the same time, which is very pertinent. If peace gains us a few years' respite from the wars to come, frivolity will soon have forgotten everything till the day of the new eruption of hell. This time, the last of our life, is the time in which your friends and ours died, totally sacrificed, crushed, destroyed in heaps like vermin, nor ever to accept what this world has done, what men have done. And again, one of the reasons I'm really interested in quotations like this is because often in the kind of secularization narrative that is still very dominant in literary studies, we hear over and over again that by the end of the 19th century, the idea of hell has vanished. Nobody believes in hell anymore. Maybe they believe in heaven because it feels a bit nicer, but that kind of dualism is just completely gone. And of course, as soon as you turn to any of the kind of, particularly Catholic writers, in that kind of mystical tradition, hell is very, very present, and it's also there before people. Her embrace of darkness is then at once terrifying and redemption, and yet its illumination in poetry can offer saving absolution. She says, and again in her journal, God alone, he alone can receive our acceptance, the silencing of our complaint, through arid, naked faith in his mercy and his wisdom, unspeakably betrayed by the appearances which are our reality. Then poetry, let poetry do penance, let her be silent, because she has not words for the reality of our time. Let her veil her face, let her stop flirting with our sorrow, let her forget flowers, games, graces, rhetoric and eloquence, let her strip herself and humble herself if she wishes to survive the unimaginable, the indescribable, the mortal darkness of our time. One of the last poems in the 1965 English translation of Reiser's poems, translated by an anonymous Benedictine, is the poem All is Light. Its stripped back simplicity, at once penitent and redemptive. This final image embodies a brightness that can only come from a dark wayfaring out of the nocturnal and the diurnal into God. And I'll finish with this poem, but again, I'm not suggesting that somehow the light comes and then all the darkness is gone. I'm almost suggesting that she adopts a kind of non-dualist understanding of darkness and light in her kind of negotiation of it, simply in order to kind of keep going. All is light. All has been given, the anguish is stilled, death fulfilled. How my soul weighs light. My spirit is given to God in his care. My heart is pure as mountain air. Everything is bright.